Good evening and welcome to another episode of vBrownbag APAC. I'm your host and presenter tonight, Brett Johnson, or at BrettJohnson008 on Twitter. So tonight we're going to go through Microsoft File Services. We're going to cover the basic protocols, SMB, NFS, and iSCSI, and a little bit of DFS. So tonight's more about how to set up each of these and give you a bit of understanding so you can start testing them out, say, in your own home lab. File services are fairly lightweight if you want to test them out at home, and yeah, so you can start learning a bit more about it yourself. And in a couple of later episodes, we'll start going through things like file server management and sort of get a bit deeper in the details there. So before we get into our topic, we'll just a couple of quick notes to cover. So if you want to follow anyone on from or any of the vBrownbag content on Twitter, we've got a couple of hashtags at the top, and our primary ones are the first three. So at vBrownbag or at vBrownbagLatam and at vBrownbagEMEA. And all our posts related to what we're doing always have the vBrownbag hashtag. And we also have a few live shows as well throughout the week. So if you're interested, you can always watch live. And if you want to see anything we've recorded before, there is always our YouTube channel or vbrownbag.com as well. Okay, so let's just get straight into this. So primarily with Windows File Servers, you got your three main protocols for actually doing your files share. So you've got your SMB or CIFS, which is Server Message Block or Common Internet File System, NFS and iSCSI. A bit out of order from the way I wrote it to what I said, but that's how it is. So DFS and with DFSR is more of a way of presenting the files. So we'll go into the details there. And deduplication is a way to help get a bit more space out of your hard drives. So files that aren't getting used as much, or when you have a lot of files with quite a bit in common, it can reduce the space. But again, sort of bit later on in the episode. So starting off with SMB, this is most commonly used for Windows environments. This is what most of any Windows file shares you deal with will actually be. So you'll use SMB quite commonly. Works very well with Windows file systems. You can mount SMB shares on Linux and OS X systems as well, but it is primarily used for Microsoft environments. Generally, each version of Windows Server will have a new version of SMB with a few changes. Sometimes they're slight changes, sometimes they can make quite a bit of difference. Opportunistic locking is one of those ones which did have a bit of an impact, where it wasn't about file locking and stopping people accessing it, as the name sort of suggests. It was more about caching that file on a computer to make it quicker to actually access, especially if you're on a slow link. It could provide some benefits. Now, if you are changing the file servers, you're going to newer ones, have a look at what version of SMB you're going to be using, assuming you're going to be using SMB, of course, and just make sure it works with what you do. Sometimes, or most of the time, the changes is no issue at all. You won't really notice them. It's all great. Other times, though, might have some older applications that don't handle it well. Sometimes there could just be something a bit funky going on in the background. So they're just a couple of things to keep an eye out, and just do a bit of reading before you dive right in. So if we wanted to set up a SMB share, there's a couple of ways to do it, and the quickest way we can do it is right-clicking on a folder and saying share this folder. I've probably got one here. Let's just make a new one. So I've got a folder called test. Obviously my naming's as original as ever. And I can just go share the folder. Who do I want to share it with? Don't hit share. That's an SMB share. That's done. It's the easiest way to set up a share. You can also come into Server Manager. Sorry, just before I do that, we'll stop sharing this. Stop sharing. And that will just, obviously, as it mentions, it stops it sharing. So we can see it here. I've highlighted it there. It's saying it's still shared. We just need to refresh this and it will disappear. Sorry. Now, if we want to use Server Manager to share a file, so once we go into Server Manager, down the left-hand side, there we go. We've got File and Sharing Services. Now, to have this appear, we do need to install the File Services roles, which I've installed every one of them for this demonstration. So I'm going to take the assumption here you're used to installing roles on servers, or you know the process of it. So I'm just going to skip to the roles. And under here, File Services, so essentially I just ticked at the top and grabbed everything. So just because it's a lab and it covers everything I want to do, and it's just quicker. So in real life, you would just install the ones you need. Like if you don't need iSCSI, there's no point installing it. Once you install it, you get a file and storage services. And to set up a new share, we can go to Shares, right click, New Shares. Now, when we're setting up a SMB share, we've got three options here. So we've got Quick, which just asks for the general information, where is this folder located that we're going to share out, who can access it, what are we going to call it, fairly straightforward settings. Now, when we go into Advanced, we get Quotas and Management Properties, and this is more about limiting how much people can do so you can control the growth. Because when you're dealing with file servers, if you give users unlimited access, they will use everything. Users are very, very good at filling up all space you make available. So, and they're also, if you do decide to do thing you're doing quotas, do it as close to implementation as you can. Make it part of that implementation. Because if they start off with limited resources, it's going to be a lot easier than actually trying to put it in after the fact. And with SMB share application, I think this is actually a new one from Server 2016. So it's appropriate for Hyper-V databases, that sort of thing. So it's slightly different. And I believe this is actually a new one in 2016 because it's not something I've played with yet. So we're just going to do the quick one tonight. So on here now we can go by volume. I've honestly never done it by volume. I've always had a file created, or a folder already created to do it. So I could type in the folder name, or if we hit Browse, we can go in here, find the folder, select, and we're done. Now, the share name doesn't have to match the folder name, so we can call this share, let's call it Bobby McGee. There we go. Now, on the other settings options, we've got a couple here. And access-based enumeration is a really good one, and where possible, I definitely recommend enabling it. What this does is says if you don't have access to the share, you can't see it. If you don't have it enabled, people can still see that the share exists even if they can't access it. And the idea is if you can't see that a share exists, you're less likely to actually try to access it. So we can turn that on. That's it. There's no additional setting for it. It's just a tick box there. Now, under permissions, so first of all, these are the share. So that shows at the top here. You can see share permissions, everybody, full control. And these ones here are our NTFS permissions. So we'll cover NTFS permissions a bit more when we get to that and share. But as you can see here, the default is everyone full control. And create, and it's done. So if I was to go to, we can see my share Bobby McGee, and I'll put a folder in there. And if I come back to the C drive, I have a folder. So SMB shares in that regard are quite simple. Set them up, and really setting up shares is the easy part. It's the managing, working out how much space they need, and making sure also that your users don't, or you've got appropriate restrictions to make sure the users aren't filling up volumes and causing server issues in that regard. Now, NFS. I really haven't had to set it up much in Windows environments, even from Windows Server perspective, but the option is there. It's primarily for such environments such as Linux or Unix. When you share a NFS, when you share a folder, like what we did with the test folder there, we did it as SMB, but there's nothing stopping us from sharing that exact same folder as an NFS share. So you can't. What this means is, like, one example where I've done this before is I had a share that I've created for people to put ISO images in there, so disk images that we would use to install operating systems on virtual machines, and they would access that as an SMB share like everything else. But it also had an NFS share which could be mounted as a data store in ESX or in vSphere. So then we didn't need to do any transferring, where someone could just dump their ISO in there and go to, and then vSphere, or whichever host we were using doing the install on, could see that to install that virtual machine. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, so there are a couple of options there for what you might use it for, or if people say on Linux machines don't want to access SMB shares, you can do that without having to set up more storage to duplicate your files or anything like that. So there's support for NFS 4.1 and 3. So 4.1 does offer a lot of advantages over 3, including multipathing and authentication, such as Kerberos authentication. When connecting those, especially if you're connecting to an older device that may not support NFS 4.1, so you do need to check with whatever's connecting to that what its support is for that protocol. So just like all the other file services available that we can be a file server for, it's already been installed as a server role. So we'll go back to our test folder here. So we've got that test one that we're sharing, and I'll get rid of this share that I was playing around with. Okay, so new share, and just like SMB, we have a couple of options for how we share it, and the difference is the same. So when we go to advanced, we get management properties and quotas. Again, in far as what we're going through with this recording, we're not really interested in those, we're just showing the basic setup. And so again, the process for selecting it and naming is very similar. So we'll call this one testing. Again, this doesn't need to match, it's another arbitrary value. Now, as we can see here, the remote path is a bit different in the way it displays it. So for our other share, it actually shows it as general. Now I can't remember where it's actually going to show it. It's going to be one of those nights. So it will show that share path in what's called a UNC. So that's a UNC path that if you work in Windows environments, you'll be quite used to using, whereas the remote path for NFS, as we can see here, has the file server : and then a /. So when Windows environments use backslashes like C:\\. Linux, your root directory starts off as a /. Now we can turn on authentication parameters here. These depend on the capabilities of what's connecting and what you've set up. So if you've set up your Kerberos and that, you can go through. You can also do unmapped access and anonymous access. So for example, some devices connected might not support the ability to authenticate and they require anonymous access. And if you do that, as you can see, it requires let everybody. So that's a big warning saying, hey, your security is not that good. And just the same, we have other options here. We have the all machine option down the bottom, which is pretty much anything can access. So in this example, we are doing away with security completely. Not recommended for anything production. We can lock it to a specific host, a net group, or we can group net groups are via a network, or we can put clients into what's called a client group. And then we can set the share permissions. And if we want, we can allow root access, which is not recommended as it says there. So that can access the root of the actual share, so not always the best thing. And NTFS permissions, they're the same as any other NTFS permissions. The share permissions, the wording and that changes, not NTFS. And we get our confirmation page of what we're doing, and we're done. Now you can install, I don't think I put it in here, I didn't. You can install a client for NFS on a Windows server, so you can access NFS shares hosted by other environments. With this, you have to use the mount command in command line to actually mount it. It requires anonymous access, so even though you can do a authentication when it acts as an NFS server, when it acts as an NFS client, it's a bit of a different story, and it's not a persistent mounting. So every time you restart, unless you have maybe this command in a startup or logon script, you're not going to maintain that mapping. Now, NFS has another management area of itself. So this is when we've got the client installed for network protocols, its mounting permissions, and what security it supports there. So it does support some security, but again, it needs that anonymous access, so it can do the so when it comes in with the authentication. So server for NFS, we can disable the support of NFS 3. So if we have nothing that connects with NFS V and we want NFS 3, and we want to make sure that we're only going to support maybe NFS 4.1, you need to turn this off here, and that's, you might do that because you want to have security. And you can select whether you want UDP, TCP, or both. And there's a few other basic options here in terms of file locking. So for example, if a file is locked, people are complaining about, I can't get into this, you can release it there. Activity logs, so you can what it's going to put into the activity, into the log. So if it's an active one, the more you tick, the bigger your log files, and maybe you might get too much noise. And you can enable net groups, and you can use, for example, Active Directory domains for the net groups. Okay, on to iSCSI. So unlike the other two protocols, which were file level protocols, this is a block level storage. In order to be block level, when you create the iSCSI share, or as the iSCSI target, what happens is it creates a virtual disk, a VHDX disk, just like you would use, say, for Hyper-V, that a virtual machine would see as a hard drive. So it uses that to present block storage, even though that block storage is sitting on a file system. Now, the server that we have, so in this case, file server 1, that's the target, and the client is the initiator. So when we connect from one device to the target, the client initiates it, and that's why the naming is. So it supports CHAP authentication, and you can have either or with CHAP authentication. So you can have no CHAP authentication where it's anonymous. You can have CHAP, which is the server authenticates the, I've got to remember the right way around for this, sorry, I'm having a bit of a brain lag. I think CHAP is the server initiates, authenticates the initiator, but reverse CHAP, the initiator authenticates the server. So you have the option for both of those. Now, not everything that's going to connect on iSCSI might support both. Some things might support none. So just like with NFS and what authentication is supported, you need to just check, okay, what's connecting, what can I support, and then make your adjustments as such, because there's no, it's better to find out right up front than to have to make changes to something that's already in production. So iSCSI gets its own area here. It's not a share, and I have a few spoilers there, pretending to be the TV chef here and having here's what I prepared earlier. Okay, so when we have no iSCSI shares, this is what we get. We just get a 2 click here. Is not a very interesting option, but that's what we get. And so this time I am going to select a volume, and we will call this vBrownbag iSCSI, and we'll make it 150 meg. Just think, that used to be a lot of data storage. And we'll make it dynamically expanding. So this is mainly so we can just grow it as we go, because this is fairly space constrained. I don't want to keep allocating all the space out. If you do have a higher performance requirements, fixed storage is the way to go. And then we want to, we're not going to put a path in, because we're not doing differentiating, which is you have a parent disk and then all the changes go to their own disk. So this would be if I had an iSCSI target disk and it was already had a lot of data and I wanted that, but I didn't want any, but I wanted that to say read only. Then you could put a differentiating disk where all the writes and changes would go to, but we're not doing that, so the path is grayed out. Now, I've already got iSCSI initiators already set in here, so these are my clients. So one of them will be this file server here, and one is the domain controller there. So they're already showing up because I've been making sure my lab actually works. Now with this, if you didn't have anything, this would just be blank, and we could go to new iSCSI initiator, and you'll see that we get a little bit more options. So we want to give this a name, and this is again different to the virtual disk name. It doesn't have to be the same. So Tuesday, and we want to add a initiator. Now, if we're talking about servers in Windows 7 or Server 28 R2 or later, or Windows 7 as it mentions there, we can't search for the initiator via the computer in AD. With Server 2012 and I think it's Windows 8, it comes with the initiator pre-installed. Prior to that, it was an additional download and installation. We'll go into the initiator in a little bit. So I could go browse and I can put in FS2. Which it's not finding, which is just Alrighty. I'll just have to say, believe me, it does actually work when we look for it. It's just having one of those days, I think. No, it's just going to have one of those days. But what we can do, if we have had ones prior, but it does actually work. I've been testing it, but the fun times of labs. So we have had a device connect before, for example, FS2 or the or DC1. You can see that these two sit here. Or if we've got a device that's completely new and not in Active Directory, such as a Linux box or a hypervisor, maybe KVM or ESXi, we can manually type the IQN number in. Also things such as DNS names can go in there as well. So we'll just select, oops. There we go. I didn't have it properly selected before. So it just resolves back to the IQN. So if you want, we can enable CHAP and or reverse CHAP as well. And apparently the passwords cannot be identical. Alright, here we go, just to make sure I got my order right before. So reverse CHAPS allows the authenticator to initiate the target, which is what I think I said, but probably rambled a little too much and wasn't exactly clear. Okay, so what we've said here is we've created a target. We said, okay, if this device with this IQN number tries to connect, I'm going to let it connect. So we haven't made the connection on the initiator side. All we've said is if a device with this IQN says, hey, I want to connect to you, then we're going to let it come through. And again, hey. Okay, so this is going to be our initiator. And we want to find the target. So ideally, this will work for us, and we can go quick connect, and there is the target. We have no authentication, so it just connects up. And we can also disconnect as well if we wanted to. Now, we've connected, we're not seeing anything, and that's normal. We need to go to, say, computer management or at least disk management, and now we have a new disk. As you can see, it's presented just as if it was any other disk, and this is what it means by block storage. As far as this operating system is concerned in the way it accesses, the way it sends commands, it's just another disk. And then we still have to format it, which you wouldn't have to do if you're using like a SMB share that's presented as in some sort of format, whereas this isn't. So we can put our own file system on there. So I could do, you know, REFS if I wanted, or I could not format it. Okay, I can't do REFS it seems because I've made it too small, and DFS it is. There we go, and there is my iSCSI share. So it comes up as a volume instead of a actual network share. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of difference in the way it's presented and the way it's accessed. And when we connect here, we will see that it's now connected. So if I was to go to the E drive and we go to iSCSI disk, or iSCSI virtual disk, so this is the default storage that it will actually put them. And you can see here we have iSCSI VHDX. Now these are two others, and I can actually mount those. So these are connected to nothing, and you can see these are files that I've been putting in there. Not too sure what was with the top one, but so I can actually browse that as if it was, because it's just a virtual disk. And apparently the F drive was stuffed. Okay. So DFS and DFS replication. So it's a distributed file service, and it's another way of presenting SMB shares. Instead of presenting one share at a time, what you can do is sort of group them together in what's called a namespace and present multiple, almost like a tree directory, and the users and systems that access these shares, if they're using DFS, don't see what physical server they're on. So once they access the namespace, which can be standalone or within the Active Directory partition, they can, once they access that, they see a list of folders, and these are arbitrary shortcuts. So the names of those folders don't have to match the share name, which doesn't have to match the folder name. Obviously, if you play like that, then things might get confusing, so it is usually better to make things line up a bit, so when you actually have to check at the physical server level, you might have a better idea where you're looking. So there's a couple of big advantages of DFS and replication. One is the inbuilt replication, so you can have hub and spoke where you might have a main server with bigger pipes coming out, or where a lot of changes are, where it can push changes out. You can be selective in your replication, so just because the multiple servers, or these servers are in the same namespace, even with the same sort of share, they don't have to replicate with each other either. It replicates in real time, You can also throttle the links down to, say, if you've got a small link, you don't want to chew up all the bandwidth during the day, but you might want to smash that during the night. And because the systems that access it don't see the real servers that they connect to, it can make migration easier, because if I pull file server 1 out and leave file server 2 there, the pathing is exactly the same. So I've had DFS set up before, again putting on my TV chef hat here. Now, both my servers are namespace servers, and they both have files enabled. So if we have a look here, we can see that the path to them is a UNC path. And if we go back to Server Manager, providing I didn't close it, we can see that, again, it's a SMB share. We can even go Properties and Permissions. Everything else is just the same as a SMB share. So what Namespace does essentially is it sort of abstracts that away and gives it a bit of a high level view of, okay, here's this, don't worry about what's underneath it, this is what I'm showing you, have fun. Now, servers can have multiple namespaces, and namespaces can have multiple servers. So I could add another namespace server here, and if I actually had another namespace server, and I could put that on. I don't think DC1 has the DFS role installed. If it does, there we go. We just added another server to the namespace. So this means I should have a new folder, DFS roots, and vBrownbag and test. Now, as we can see here, this is a shortcut, or technically a symbolic link, which is what we would see in the actual namespace itself. So as I mentioned, we abstract away what's there, so we don't care what's underneath. So I could just go to test, put a folder here, and I haven't set up the permission, so I can't. But we can put a folder there, and what that enables us to do is not worry about. So at the moment, as we can see with this path, I don't know which server I'm going to, and frankly, I don't need to know. There is no reason for me to know where it's going in that aspect. As long as the backend's all maintained properly, really has no bearing on what we're doing. Now, we can add new namespaces. So we'll create one FS on file server 1, and we'll call this name recording. And we don't want to store this in DFS roots there, we'll put it here. We'll put it in that one. And for all users have read and write permissions, we'll just make this really simple. Now we can do a namespace as a domain namespace, so this is where it stores it as part of the Active Directory partition. And if you really want, you can actually go into ADSI edit and see it. I can't remember the full path to it, so won't worry about it. It's actually not that interesting, but you can see that it exists in the partition there if you really want. Or a standalone namespace server, and a standalone does actually use the UNC path. And that's it, we've got another namespace up. Now to create a namespace, because it does store, or Active Directory namespace, because it does store in Active Directory, you do need rights to Active Directory to create it. Essentially, I believe you need to be at least a domain admin to do this. As I mentioned before, I can't see where this is going. However, if I go under here, we can see I've got a folder. So then I can add another namespace server. We'll do this to FS2, and we'll put this in the same location just for consistency's sake, and consistency does make life a lot easier. And we've got errors. Fantastic. There you go, I haven't set up my permissions properly. Let's put it in DFS roots. Oops. There we go, that took more effort than I should have. Again, if we actually went to the second file server, which I don't think I did as a server core, I can't remember. Nope, I actually have something to show you. And we go to DFS roots, and we can see we've got the folder there. Now this is all great, except these are not replicating yet. Now there's a couple of ways to create replication. I've got the test one up here, or I can create a new replication group, and we can have a multi-purpose one, or for group data collection. So we'll do a multi-purpose recording or recording. So which servers do we want to replicate? Now, again, we don't have enough servers here to do hub and spoke. If I added one more, I could. And hub and spoke I touched on a bit before. So if you've got like a HQ where a lot of changes made, or it's got the big pipes to push out, that's where a hub and spoke might be a big benefit. So you can get it out to the remote sites instead of having remote sites with small links trying to replicate to each other. Remote sites, full mesh is the next one, where everything talks to everything as a standard full mesh does, and it recommends not doing that for anything more than 10 servers in the topology. Or custom or no topology, and you can set that up later. We're going to do full mesh. We can set up the when we talk about scheduling, this is bandwidth scheduling. We're just going to leave it at full for now, but I will show you that. Now, a primary member, what this is this is what is the authoritative one for this initial replication. And one of the key times to make, where this can be quite important, is if you're putting in another DFS server and it's going out to a remote site, but you want all that data is on another one already, then you might want to make sure that you might want to have these two replicate, maybe in their own replication group, maybe not, but you want these two to replicate quickly, and you don't want this new server trying to get it from down the WAN somewhere. You want it to go, hey, here's the one I'm sitting next to, we got a nice fat 10 gig pipe, let's just get that done, and then we can seed faster and make the changes that we need. So with the actual replication path, we're looking at local, and this is one of the interesting things, is that this doesn't have to match with I've got that in another group. It doesn't have to match the actual folder that you've got with the share. So you've given it a share folder up here under the namespace, but you haven't provided a local file. So now you have to provide a local file. All right, so we're going to make a new folder. And sorry, I feel like I've just done this completely wrong. I think it's because it's still sitting in DFS test. Don't know why I'm just starting to question this, but we'll go with the RE folder. And this is so we've set up our primary member. So the one I was doing before was the primary, so where the data is going to come from. And I think my previous configurations is what's caused this issue, where I've just sort of done it and haven't really paid attention to what I'm doing to make sure it's there. Okay, and my little joined up network is giving bad connectivity. Gotta love when labs don't work while you're recording it, eh? Okay. This is why I was getting that error before. So I've got a replication here of the root of DFS test. This is from my previous ones that I set up. This is why I was getting that error. And that was going to testings for my file server 2. So this was for the vBrownbag, the VBB one that I was doing. And I have a feeling I didn't. Yes. So that's where that error was coming from. So at least we know, and wasn't completely doing it wrong. It was just, yeah, I'd set it up before and obviously didn't really pay too much attention to when I was testing it, just making sure things talked. But as we can see with what I've put inside, this has come through. So there's my recording folder that I'm also sharing elsewhere, and that new folder that I created. And that and the reason for my error was I had the permissions one was that E drive that I had mounted on file server 2 is not there, and I have a feeling that there's a good chance that it was also an iSCSI share that I got rid of when I was cleaning up. So that's the reason for our permissions, and that's the reason why things are a bit broken, is because I cleaned up probably a little too much. So what will happen is when I use this, providing I had my permissions, is because I set this up to all users have only read access, so I haven't actually changed the permissions other than that default. So if I create a folder here, depending on that replication policy, it's just going to push it out when it's got the capacity or it's caught up, and that's just going to push out to anyone else in that replication group. So with the replication group, we can set schedules for how we're going to control the bandwidth. So this is as you can see here, we've got two options, UTC or local time of the receiving member. So for example, if I have a lot of sites and in different time zones, so Australia, like you might have a group in WA and another one in Victoria, or servers there, and you set this to be 8 AM to 8 PM where it's slow, it will be based on what time that actually receiving is. So from about, 2 hours difference between WA, so from 10 AM Victorian time, it will actually slow down for what it sends to WA, and then WA will send slow until 8 PM Victorian time, which is 6 PM WA time. So it works again on the receiving member's side. And you can fine tune each day, and you can add a lot of very specific scheduling if you prefer. So you could say, 12 o'clock-ish, a lot of people on lunch. We'll make that a bit faster. Now, under connections as well, we can make changes here to the schedule per connection. So you can do it for the whole group, or if you have a site that's specifically slow, you can slow it down without affecting the rest of the group. So there are some little areas you can play with and have a look. Now, I think what we have next is deduplication. There we go. So deduplication is a role service, and what it allows you to do is on a per volume basis, schedule a time for Windows to come in and say, okay, what hasn't been used or what's cold data that hasn't been changed within so many days. Great. And then it tries to find areas where it can remove duplication, hence the name deduplication, and make it faster. So it calls it, the terming that they use in Windows Server is optimization, but essentially it's also just data reduction. There's another way to think of it. So it's a post process. So that means you need to have the storage originally to put the data in there. So if you're putting 10 gig a week in and you run optimization once a week, you need to be able to store that 10 gig on per week, and then it will bring that down. So you need to have, you can't just say, oh yeah, we're going to be really efficient with data deduplication. I made a typo. Sorry, distracted. So with that, you can't just say, oh yeah, we'll put as much in. You need to allow for that. You need to allow to create that data in its raw form, undeduplicated, and then and then for the system to actually make the changes and do what it needs to do. So under deduplication, under volumes, so there's no specific menu or tool sort of thing, like a management tool or anything like you would have under here for dedupe. What you have is under disks, you select a volume. Would not recommend it doing to your C drive, but we're not actually going to activate it. And actually, we can't do it to a system drive, so I need another drive. I don't think I've given this one. One moment, please. Actually, we've got a couple there. There we go. Now we're going to have another drive to do. Of course. Sorry, it's late in the evening and I didn't click on the others. Okay, so with our drives, we've actually got a couple here. And again, I'm going to blame late in the evening and caffeine levels dropping. So when we select the actual disk, we can then select a volume within that disk and go to configure data deduplication. By default, when you install, it's disabled. It doesn't try to do anything, so you do need to manually configure it, which is good, because during the deduplication or optimization process, it is going to use the disk a fair bit. There is a background mode that it has as part of the scheduling where it tries to do it, but again, try as it might, it just has to use some sort of disk I/O, so it disables it by default. So general purpose file server, this is what we would be looking for a server, or if we're hosting, say, VDIs, which is a really good use case for dedupe, as you might have 30 images of the exact same operating system. So deduplication will take that away, or virtualized backup server. So backups, again, have a lot of duplicated data. So we're a general file server, and we want it to look at files that are over 7 days old. So we might know that once a file is 7 days old, people really don't touch it. So we don't need to worry about that. By default, it will exclude Exchange databases and JRS files. You can put other ones in here, so you might want MDB files, for example, because you don't want it to try to deduplicate a database. You can also exclude folders as a whole. If I actually had any, this would actually mean it's not going to do anything. If I did that root folder there, it's just not going to work. That would pretty much turn it off. And then we can set the scheduling. So background optimization, this is where it detects, hey, look, the server's pretty idle, not doing much. Let's just see if we can get some dedupe in. And ideally, it'll be very little impact. But again, some environments that we might have very spiky where your load on the server suddenly goes up through the roof. You may not want that. And if it's running a deduplication optimization, your users may feel that, and then your phone rings. Now, we have two schedule options here, so which is kind of nice. We select the day of the week, fairly obvious. We put the start time in, but we don't put a finish time in, we put a duration. So 3 hours, so for example, this one, Monday through Friday, runs from 12 AM till 3 AM. People don't start work till 7:30, maybe we'll run that for 7 hours, and then we might have it on the weekend where it's going to start on Friday at 8 PM and run for 24 hours. So that would run it from 8 PM Friday for 24 hours, and then Saturday 8 PM 24 hours. So, and that would take that all the way to 8 PM Sunday. And we apply it, and it's done. And to be honest, in terms of a demonstration, there's really not much to actually show. I've got data duplication on. We can see that it's got a certain rate and the actual savings. As I don't have any files there, I can't really show too much. Okay, so with mapping, we've gone over the UNC path. They can be mapped to a drive letter. Drive letter mapping can be done through the command Namespace use. So, which server am I looking for? I've got to remember my names that I've given everything. So for a net use command, they're quite straightforward. Net use, then drive letter that we want to give it. Then we put in the UNC path. So for example, fs1 \testing. And in Windows Explorer, we will see that we have a T drive. So that's one of the most common ways to access shares on a Windows system. The other would be typing in, ideally typing correct server names. And we can just punch open a share from there. Now with NetUse, we can also remove a drive mapping. And that will get rid of that T drive in a moment. There it goes. Now you can use, if you want to mount it to a folder, instead of a drive letter, you can use mklink. I can't remember that command off the top of my head. I believe it's mklink source and destination. Let's give this a try and see if we do it wrong. File already exists. Okay. Alrighty, so we already have a file existing, so obviously, yes, this is not a command I've had to use often. I think it's been probably at least about 3 years since I've actually done it. I haven't really seen mapping to a folder done very often. So yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time on that one. Logon scripts, a fairly typical one now. They are being phased out. So logon scripts are generally either a batch or VBS script to say, hey, map this here. Sort of been phased out for GPO preferences, and then you get a lot more flexibility in GPO preferences in who you assign to what, and it's a lot easier to manage than a logon script. So before we look at GPO preferences, in AD, you can actually put shares into the directory, so people can look for a share in the actual directory itself. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind is when you put a share into directory, there is no validation. So I've put the UNC path here. My whole entire environment revolves on 3 servers, nothing named like that. AD doesn't care. It's just putting it in there. So when you do that, definitely pays to make sure your spelling's right. Even my preferred way when I actually put it in is to open up the share, copy, so get the UNC path, copy and paste, because I've fat fingered that so many times. Now, if we have a policy, we'll pretend this lapse deployment policy is one for managing shares for users. If we go to Preferences and Windows Settings, we have Drive Maps. If we right-click New Mapped Drive, we can select how we want to map a drive. Now, I could put in, I can paste in the UNC path if I like. So again, as I mentioned before, copy and paste it saves a lot of headaches. Or if I go browse, I can see the 2 that I had in directory. Now, just like AD, this will not validate it. So there are a couple of ways to have a look at how to do it. Have a play with that, see what the different options are, and yeah, mapping drives in that aspect is fairly straightforward. You just need to make sure, the biggest thing is making sure you pass the right, and then you should be pretty much on track. Okay, so I'll touch a little bit on the security aspects of it. So with shares, there's 2 levels of security. There's a shared level, and then there's the NTFS security. Now, whichever of these 2 is the most restrictive is going to take preference. So if I've only got read access at the share level, it doesn't matter that I've got full control at NTFS. I've got read access. That's as far as it's concerned. So the most restrictive wins. Now, earlier in this piece, we had a look and we created that share and the C drive, and the share permissions for it were to have everybody full control. Oh, wait, that's the NFS one. Or was it Bobby McGee? I think it was Bobby McGee. Permissions, everybody full control. Essentially, this disables share permissions. So this means everybody that don't need to be authenticated, it's pretty much anonymous access, gets full control. So it goes straight through the share permissions. Then it's up to the NTFS permissions. If you do choose to do share and NTFS, then you need to make sure that you've got those lined up. So the groups that need write access have write access in the share permissions as well. And this is part of the reason why it's fairly actually common to see everybody full control, because there is a bit more management overhead. And sometimes when you've got an issue with people not being able to access a share and you've got a bit of pressure to get it sorted, you may not look at the share permissions, you may just look at the NTFS and sit there spinning your wheels. So I would say it's up to you, but it's more likely to be up to policy on what you do. NTFS permissions, you get a lot more options. So share, you get 4 options really. And this is actually more than what it used to be. It used to be read, write, change. Now you've got full control and special. So in NTFS permissions, we select the security principal. So this could be the user or the group, for example. What's my test username? There we go, Bon Jovi. We get our basic set of permissions here: read, write, modify, list, execute. So if I've got folders where general users might have to traverse through to get to what they can actually access properly, I might only get them to be able to list contents. There are more advanced options as well in here to traverse. That's the one we want. Traverse and execute. So we might depend on what we want. We can go, so we can add a few more, change ownership, so we can get a fairly granular in this aspect. We can also add conditions now. I believe this was a new thing in, I want to say 2012. So users might need to be members of two groups, or if they're a member of one group and a member of another one, they don't get permissions, or they're not allowed to access it. So yeah, that's a interesting thing to add. Well, to me, another level of complexity, but some people might argue another level of security. Now, with modify and write doesn't always allow writing. It depends on the way the application works. So I'm just going to grab a blank folder on my computer and bring that across. So I'm just getting rid of the navigation plane because I don't think you need to see everything there. There we go. Now, when a write permission doesn't allow write is something I came across a while ago, and what I was looking at was a Word document where a user couldn't edit the Word document. So we went through and we cleaned up, and we didn't want users in certain areas to be able to specifically move files, which also meant delete, because a delete is a copy, then a move is a copy and then a delete. So, and what was happening is people were moving folders around and saying they lost them, but all they did is accidentally click and drag them elsewhere. So the call was made to remove what's called a modify permission. So the difference between a modify and a write is a modify allows a delete, whereas write it only allows updating a file. Now, after we made these changes, we noticed that, we started getting calls that Word documents, users couldn't update Word documents. They still had write access, but they couldn't update a Word document, which seemed a bit strange because technically it's writing. But here's the thing. So I've enabled the ability to view system files, and I've just launched a Word document, a very riveting Word document, as we can see, and this is the key to it, to why this didn't work, is in those folders it created this little temporary folder, which was no issue at all. Absolutely no issue that temporary folder was there. They could create that just fine with only write permissions. The problem is when I close my Word document, it goes away, i.e. it's been deleted. So that inability to delete that file caused issues. So one thing to keep in mind. Now the other option, but if we have, say, a Notepad document, just a text file, it doesn't open anything extra, so it doesn't need that modify permission. So when deciding between write and modify, just have a look, even enable system things, see what's actually created, where it's created. If there's an option, maybe, for example, in Office, I don't recall looking at the time to see if there was an option to move that temporary file elsewhere. So I can't give advice for specifically how the best way to get around. We ended up needing to allow modify at the time. I can't remember off the top of my head, to be perfectly honest, but it's one of those things that before making changes to the permissions, understand how it interacts, what's actually required. Start small, maybe have a group where that's an option to change it. Like if you've got a group where you might give a couple of users with more restricted permission, make sure it doesn't interrupt their workflow, and grow it out from there. Now, the main other thing is denies, and there's my slideshow. It's only PowerPoint, we don't need it. The other thing to keep in mind is a deny always overrules a allow. So if I'm a member of one group that is allowed access to a file, but I am a member of another group that is denied access to a file, I can't access it because the deny overrides the allow. It comes back to the most restrictive is the most restrictive wins. And that pretty much wraps up everything I want to cover. If you are deploying a file server, other than one, like a lot of people plan for disk capacity, that sort of thing, permissions, plan for backups. How are you going to back it up? How can you recover it? Can users use a self-service portal? Many backup programs offer that as well. Very important things, because users do have a habit to delete files, move files, make unintentional changes to files, that sort of thing. So yeah, definitely, if you are going to look at any sort of thing with creating new new file server solutions, keep that in mind on how you're actually going to back up that data. And if there are options, have a look for backup programs that allow you to self-service or that sort of thing to get files back, so you don't have to have as many things, like as many tickets open or many requests. So thank you very much for watching. I'm Brett Johnson at BrettJohnson008 on Twitter. And if you want to see what the rest of the vBrownbag crew are up to, we've got a hashtag vBrownbag or vBrownbag.com. And thank you once again.